Good morning, everyone. Thank you for attending. I think we're probably going to kick off with the webinar now. And thanks for taking time out of what I'm sure is a very busy schedule at the moment for many of you. And I suspect it's been a pretty challenging time, as it has for us as well. There's been so much for businesses to get their heads around over such a short period of time, and who'd even heard of furlough leave 4 months ago? I think over the last 4 months, I've read more government guidance in that time than I have in the last 4 years put together. So over the next 45 minutes, you're going to hear from my colleagues, Patrick Lencross and Melanie Stancliffe, and we're going to try and help make your lives a little bit easier, or at least impart some of our knowledge and experiences we've had over the last few months to you. Patrick's going to start by talking about the new flexible furlough scheme and the hidden traps with that. I'm then going to go on and talk about how you manage a safe return to work for your staff. And then Mel's going to be taking a look at efficiency planning, redundancies, and utilising the ACAS Early Conciliation process. And at the end, we're going to save some time for some question and answers. So there's a chat function at the bottom of your screen. So do feel free to put questions in as you go along. And we'll also leave our contact details on the screen at the end. So if you think of any questions that you didn't answer at the time but you want to ask later, then please do feel free to get in touch. So Patrick, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you a whistle-stop tour through the minefield of the new flexible furlough scheme. So I'm assuming some familiarity with the essential framework, and obviously 1st of July, this Wednesday, is the kick-off date for this new scheme. And what I'm particularly going to be doing is identifying some of the traps and the pitfalls, and always expect the unexpected when it comes to the flexible furlough scheme. Rona mentioned guidance. There's, I think, 6 sets of HMRC guidance or updated guidance. There's a 34-page Treasury direction. I hope that you don't have to plough your way through those documents, and what I'm doing is condensing the key points from those into this presentation. So looking firstly at the question of eligibility, who is eligible for this new scheme of flexible furlough, and the previously furloughed rule should be firmly stamped into your memory by now. So it's only accessible to employees furloughed under the old scheme for a minimum of 3 weeks. Hence the cut-off date we had of 10th of June for any new cases of furlough. So whether it's employees who are still on furlough at the moment, or were on furlough and have already come back to work, that is the pool of people who are eligible. And just to highlight, what you can't do is utilise this scheme for those employees who have been working reduced hours throughout the lockdown period but were never actually put onto furlough. So exceptions to this previously furloughed rule. There's a big one for those returning from statutory parental leave, such as maternity leave after the 10th of June. There's also an exception made for any military reservists coming back to work after a period of mobilisation. And there's a special rule for any incoming employees on a TUPE transfer, provided they were previously furloughed with their old employer. Recently refurloughed employees, there's a little catch here. If you have somebody who was on furlough before and came back to work, and then you've put them back on furlough after the 10th of June, you need to wait 3 weeks, even though that may take you well beyond the 1st of July, in order before they can come back into work in any capacity. So in effect, it's a hangover of the old 3-week minimum rule under the old scheme, which you have to live with. Then the question of selection. How do you go about choosing who to put onto the new flexible furlough arrangements? And the general rule is that this will be driven by where you identify the areas of demand in your business as you reopen, or as you move away from skeleton operations towards normal levels of operations. There may be situations where you need to be a bit more sophisticated than that, and somehow devise a method for picking who to leave on full furlough, who to bring back into the workplace on flexible furlough. And again, maybe some situations where you need to give particular employees priority. there is a discrimination risk, as there was with the original furlough decisions. Although saying that, I'm not sure whether this is more a theoretical risk and whether there are genuinely allegations of discrimination being raised about these selection processes. But for example, if as a business you decided, okay, we won't ask back any female employees with children who are of school age because we assume or expect that they will be the ones who've got primary responsibility for homeschooling or looking after them during the school holidays, that will ring alarm bells about indirect sex discrimination. So you've just got to be a bit more sophisticated and careful than that. Point there about refusing to return. Could there be some cases where employees are reluctant to come back to work? And if so, what are the reasons behind that? And it goes back to the point that employee consent is critical for the working of flexible furlough, because it operates as a consensual variation to the individual's employment contract, unless you've already got some built-in obligation to return part-time if the employer demands it, which is unlikely. So look, I try and identify what are the reasons why the employee is reluctant. Is it because of childcare issues during the summer holidays, in which case is there a way around that? Is it because of anxieties about your COVID secure arrangements in the workplace? Again, try and address those. In theory, if there's work to be done and the employee is point blank refusing to come back to work, even part-time, yes, that could open up grounds to dismiss on SOSRA grounds, but that's a very much last resort. So the watchword there is identify the practical reasons for the reluctance to try and address those. Shielding employees, so it's still the case that if you are clinically extremely vulnerable, you should be shielding at least until the 1st of August. And that's the date when there's a relaxation of the guidance for those individuals. So as a business, you should not be asking back anybody who is in that category, for example, somebody undergoing chemotherapy because of a cancer condition. And remember again, any medical basis for shielding almost inevitably will also be a disability. You have that reasonable adjustments duty in that situation. Different scenario after the 1st of August, where the guidance will be relaxed so that individuals can return to work so long as the workplace is COVID secure. And finally on this slide, there is this, what they call the high watermark rule. So this is brought in as an anti-fraud measure, the maximum employees per claim period. So the number of employees claimed for in a single claim period, and we'll look at what claim periods are later, cannot be greater than the maximum number of employees that you claimed for under any claim ending on or before 30th of June, with the exception of those coming back to work after statutory parental leave. And this can be a real issue where you are rotating employees. So maybe you had a block of employees who brought back half of them already, and you now want to rotate those. And the solution here may be that you have to align your rotation cycle with the claim period, or the other way around, align your claim period with your rotation cycle, whatever is more efficient and easier to administer for your business. So if we can move to the next slide. So what's the process to go through for flexible furlough? What's clear from the guidance is that you need a new written agreement in place that confirms the new furlough arrangement. So that goes beyond just we've had a discussion, here's confirmation of that discussion. It is an agreement, although there's no specifics set down for what has to be within that written agreement. Again, question raised, do you need a fresh agreement every time that you have a tweak to your pattern of working hours? Well, we and others don't think so. The way to do it is to have an overarching, flexible, in all senses, agreement, which builds in the facility to vary the working pattern as you go along. Equally builds in the option to make other changes which may be necessary because of changes to the HMRC guidance, if the previous furlough scheme is any model to go by. Some cases, if you're dealing with a large-scale workforce, it may be necessary to go through a Section 188 collective consultation. as part of introducing these changes to contracts, but usually speaking that won't be necessary. So fixed pattern or flexible is one of the options to consider when looking at your agreement. Can you at this point say, we need this person back on Monday, Wednesday and Friday, set that down in black and white, or is it a more vague commitment to say, going forward, we will be needing to bring you back as and when, not quite sure when it's going to be, but where, it's a balance between, from the employee's point of view, they like to have certainty and predictability, particularly if they're looking after family responsibilities, travel arrangements. But obviously from a business point of view, you may not be able to predict at this moment what your work needs are going to be. So it's a question of striking that balance. And for example, one way to do it is along the lines of a weekly or fortnightly rota, and then you tell the employees long enough in advance, let's say a week at least in advance, okay, this particular week we will ask you to work Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, whatever it is. And remember, no longer any minimum period of furlough, so we don't have this rule about having to be on furlough for minimum period of 3 weeks. Rotation, as I've mentioned, is one option. So you can either rotate everybody who's coming back under flexible furlough, or you can look back at some of those who already come back into workplace after furlough and putting them into the rotation cycle as well. Then you've got the employees on full furlough, and remember, as I say, the old scheme is going as of the 30th of June. You need to check that their continuing furlough is properly covered under the terms of your original agreement, so that you may have said it's until further notice, for example. And be careful where you've got staff returning back to work in the middle of the month. Let's say you've got staff coming back on the 6th of July, they would need to be dealt with under the new scheme. So you would need to carry out this complicated hours calculation to work out the furlough grant in the period before they come back into work. Similarly, if you've got a changeover in a rotation cycle, which is within the middle of, say, in the middle of the month, in the middle of your claim period. Again, think about the facility of aligning return to work dates and rotation changeover dates with when you have your claim periods. So then, question of record keeping, and this is where it gets administratively more complicated than the old scheme. And the HMRC guidance is very clear. So it's saying you need to keep these records for 6 years, although one of the guidance documents says 5 years, but on erring with safety go for 6 years. And this is connected with the greater potential for fraud with flexible furlough, the greater potential for audits after the event by HMRC, and a greater level of vigilance from their part. So the areas for record keeping, the hours worked, make sure you've got the appropriate systems for recording that, and employees are properly briefed. The usual working hours, we'll look at that in a moment, and the calculations for how you've worked out your claim. And as I say, there is a serious risk here of HMRC audit, so it needs to be audit proof as a record process. Next slide, please. So making claims, we've got a minimum claim period of 1 week, although there is an allowance for what they call orphan periods at the start or the end of a calendar month. So for example, you could have a claim period starting on Monday, the 6th of July, the start of that week, and the days before that would be a separate orphan period that you can manage. You may want to have monthly claim periods or fortnightly claim periods, but those are the options. What you can't do is straddle different calendar months, and that's all because of the scheme of employer contributions coming in. Yes, you need to think about aligning your claim periods with where the payroll cycle happens, which may present a particular challenge where, for example, your payroll needs to be finalised sometime before the end of the month. And you can still make advance claims, as with the old scheme, although this gets more difficult because you need that certainty about the hours which staff will be working. So calculating the claim, and the essential formula here, and this is where you need to dust down the maths GCSE to work this through, is a formula of A times F over U. So normal, so 80% of pay, or the ceiling, which is currently 2,500 a month, times F, which is the furloughed hours, divided by U, which is the usual hours. And looking at usual hours, what are they? Last pay period before the 19th of March for 2020 for fixed salary employees, so typically February 2020 they're monthly paid. And then remember, with variable paid staff, it's the higher of the average in the last tax year or the equivalent calendar period in the last calendar year, also the last tax year. There is you've got to work through the HMRC guidance here, because there is a slightly bizarre methodology of 30 days over total day. You think if somebody was working 50% of their normal hours, they just get 40% of their salary as the granted month in, month out. If only it was so simple. It's actually based on the working days per calendar month. So they get a slightly different figure in July, because compared to August, there are different numbers of calendar days. Although it does even out in the long run. But it's, I say, your eyes will water once you start going through the calculations. And like the cliche of science, it's just a question of following the maths and trying to work through the guidance. But leave it to the last minute is my recommendation. Employer contributions, so as you probably know, starting from the 1st of August, so you start having to pick up the national insurance and pension fees, 10% salary from September, 20% in October. There is guidance published last week about what happens for overclaiming, including the option to offset where you have overclaimed against the following month's claim. Not at all clear what you do if you've actually underclaimed a month, other than ring up HMRC and ask them very nicely. It's not something which is expressly dealt with anywhere within the guidance. So next slide, please. So finally, and on the topic of the flexible furlough scheme, what are the areas of continuing challenge, some of which will be the same as we've had under the existing scheme? As I mentioned earlier, you really need to build in the ability to vary your arrangements and be aware of the different reasons why that may be necessary, whether it's the changing needs of the business, and who knows what your customer demand and workflow patterns are going to be, or because the scheme rules themselves are changing and guidance is changing. So we would suggest building in a power to vary the arrangements by giving, where possible, 7 days notice to the individual. Bonus and commission is difficult, one to work your way through. For example, where you originally deferred or suspended those schemes, you just got to think carefully, how do you operate bonus and commission for staff where they are working part-time under flexible furlough? Do you vary those arrangements so they're getting something, or do you say, look, we've just got to suspend that until we return to a degree of normality? Internal procedures, they may have been put on hold during the original furlough, such as performance management processes. You need to think about how to review those or reset targets. Again, similarly, disciplinary and grievance procedures, as a rule, those need to be completed as practicable. Redundancy, Mel is going to be talking about. What is clear from the guidance is you can make employees on furlough, including flexible furlough, redundant. You can utilise the scheme for part payment or notice pay. However, sort of politically unpleasant that is, or criticise, the scheme does allow that to happen. Annual leave, as before, flexible furlough doesn't affect accrual or taking of statutory leave. Remember, you need to pay holiday pay at the normal remuneration rate, so that means topping up. Although you may have some flexibility to address contractual leave, how that accrues under the flexible furlough agreement. And final point to leave you with is a slightly wider question of how do you balance the interests of your flexible furlough employees with two different categories: those who are still on full furlough and those who, like ourselves, never furloughed in the first place, who've ploughed on throughout lockdown. So it's some of the sort of softer balancing of those interests, as well as from a business point of view, thinking about the financial balance. And there's a particular challenge where the never furloughed individuals have been working on reduced hours and or reduced pay, because obviously with those coming back or who have already come back, you can utilise the scheme to get some ongoing subsidy, but you don't have that option for the never furloughed staff. So that's a particular challenge which you may have. With that, I'll pass you over to my colleague.
Thanks, Patrick. Great. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about a few of the issues that clients have been raising with us as part of the process that they've gone through for opening up. The first is planning for the impact that the NHS track and trace scheme might have. The second is employee testing, and by that I'm referring to electronic temperature readings and COVID-19 tests. And then the third part is travel into work. And I know this is a really important area for many businesses and a real concern for a number of employees as well. So first of all, track and trace. Well, those contacted under the scheme will be asked to isolate for 14 days, which is likely to have a number of implications for businesses. And there are 5 areas that I wanted to highlight with you today. The first is the need to consider the impact on workers of being contacted. So workers have no legal obligation to tell you that they've been told to self-isolate. So you may wish to make this a requirement of your health and safety policy. You also need to bear in mind that workers will be less likely to follow public health guidance to self-isolate if they've got financial or job security concerns. And obviously in the current climate as it is, that could be a real issue. Employees who could be requested to self-isolate could be done or asked more than once. So that's because people who live with individuals with coronavirus symptoms are also required to isolate. So just something to be prepared for and to let your employees or to make your employees aware of that fact. The second issue is to factor test and trace into reopening risk assessment plans. So despite it not being mandatory to follow self-isolation instructions, you can include requiring compliance with test and trace notifications as part of your risk assessments and safe reopening rules. So you need to really prioritise sharing information about the test and trace scheme with your workers. And the key part of this should be clearly communicating the steps that workers need to take themselves if they are contacted. And it's also a really good idea that workers understand the health and safety measures that you've introduced into a workplace and can communicate them. And what this will do is it will help avoid unnecessary isolations, as workers will be able to tell the test and trace agents about the relevant measures in place to reduce risk of transmission, such as perspex screens. That's going to be really important, because if they're not aware of them, or they can't communicate exactly what you're doing, it's more likely that they will be deemed to be in contact and then have to isolate. The third point is being explicit in explaining how the business will support those with coronavirus self-isolation notes. Businesses are concerned that the financial support available to workers told to isolate could deter them from following isolation advice, and particularly when workers are asymptomatic. People are not eligible for statutory sick pay if they're workers, or if they are self-employed, or if they earn below £120 a week. And statutory sick pay, as you'll know, is just under £96 a week. So statutory sick pay rates could simultaneously be a financial penalty for employees who can't work because of isolation, and equally an unsustainable cost burden for employers, as the rebate is limited to small businesses only for no more than one 14-day absence period per employee. And equally, the cost for businesses that offer occupational sick pay could obviously be a lot higher than that. So businesses of all sizes are concerned about the increased cost pressures, and employees, as I've mentioned already, could be told to isolate for multiple periods of times. The financial support available from the government is continuing to evolve, as we've seen, and they are being lobbied or being asked to consider additional support for firms and individuals on this front. But as of yet, there are no changes that I'm aware of anyway in the pipeline on that front. So Despite the concerns, I think it is going to be really important for businesses to encourage staff, as I'm sure you will do, to follow, track and test and trace isolation instructions. And the main obviously benefit for doing that is that it should then help businesses by preventing a full outbreak at work and a potential period of lockdown. The fourth point I wanted to mention was keeping up to date with the criteria for self-isolation, and that's going to be quite important. So anyone at the moment who's been within 2 meters of someone who's tested positive for COVID-19 for more than 15 minutes will be asked to isolate. And at present, test and trace will only consider an individual not to be in contact where the interaction between 2 people has taken place through a perspex or equivalent screen. So at the moment, other measures that you might take to be COVID secure, they won't be considered as part of the test and trace assessment of who needs to isolate, but that obviously may change going forward. The analysis of the first 2 weeks of the NHS test and trace performance data showed that an average of 6 people are identified as contacts per positive COVID-19 test. So businesses should really consider how they would respond if, for example, several workers were asked to self-isolate at once. So how would that impact the business and how would they deal with it going forward? And the final point is to be mindful of GDPR in relation to data collection and sharing. And I'll go on to talk about that now in a bit more detail when I talk about employee testing. Right, so employee testing, what do I mean by this? Well, there's 2 types of tests that I'll be referring to. The first is electronic temperature readings, and the second is COVID-19 tests. So a number of clients at the moment are already and have been for a while or taking temperature readings or considering doing so, and they're doing that on entry and exit to the workplace in order to keep their workplaces safe. In addition to this, some of our clients have taken the extra step of getting staff tested for COVID-19 in a private medical facility, and certainly offering access to independent and repeated testing going forward may be an option to mitigate risk and ensure a safe working environment for some businesses. But it really needs to be evaluated against the latest public health guidance, and it doesn't presently replace the test and trace isolation instructions. So, for example, if they're tested in work and the test is negative, but they're still contacted by the test and trace system, then they will still need to self-isolate at the moment. Certainly the businesses that I'm aware of that have taken such steps have seen full uptake by staff to such testing, and I have not been made aware of any pushback, and indeed staff have welcomed the measures and seen those as protecting their health and safety and ensuring that they have somewhere safe to work. So I would hope that you wouldn't, that this wouldn't be too difficult an area. However, it does depend on whether you are, I think this will become key, whether you're introducing on a voluntary basis or a mandatory basis. So if you introduce these tests on a voluntary basis, then there's a number of data protection hurdles that you'll need to overcome. But from an employment law perspective alone, the scheme, if it's voluntary, will be uncontentious. If the scheme is mandatory, then you'll need to overcome the same data protection hurdles, but you'll also need to review your employment contracts to ensure that as a business, you're comfortable with the risk of an employment tribunal claim should an employee claim that mandatory testing and any associated steps taken constitute a breach of their employment contract. And in practice, I expect that a large number of businesses will be able to overcome those hurdles when it comes to taking temperature readings, but I think it's likely to be much more difficult and more challenging when you're talking about a test that is really quite an invasive test. So, you know, your own businesses will only be able to do it where it really is sort of a last resort, or there's not other less intrusive measures that they can take to protect the employees' health and safety. And it's really important that every business will be different, will be slightly different, and it needs to be approached on a case-by-case basis. So you can't approach it on a sort of sector or work type basis necessarily. If you're going to take temperature readings or get employees to take the COVID test, then I'd highly recommend that you read the ICO guidance, which was published earlier this month. And there are various things that you can do to mitigate the data protection risks, including being completely clear with workers about what use will be made of the data that you are collecting. Don't retain that for any longer than possible. So, for example, if you're taking the temperature upon entry to the building, then obviously if they don't meet the temperature reading threshold, then obviously you delete that data straight away. You'd only need to retain that data, for example, if they had a high temperature and you needed to keep that for future reference. And then if you are keeping that data for future reference, you use it for no other purpose and restrict it to a very small number of people who really need a legitimate reason to access that information. And if you're COVID testing, you only need to know the test results. Was it a positive or negative test? You don't need to know any further information about any underlying health conditions, for example. Prior to testing, you need to carry out what's called the Data Protection Impact Assessment, which sets out clearly why any measure is necessary for your specific workplace. And this document's important because it will be the first thing that a regulator will ask you for if your testing process was ever called into question from a data protection perspective. And then the final point on this is if an employee does test positive for COVID-19, then where absolutely possible, you should refrain from naming that individual within the workplace to colleagues, etc. If naming the individual is necessary, then organisations shouldn't share that information wider than is strictly necessary. So do all you can to minimise the spread of that information. The final point I wanted to talk about today was travel into work. So where do your legal responsibilities as an employer start and where do they end? Well, typically from an employment law perspective, the journey into work has always usually been the employee's responsibility. And certainly health and safety legislation only covers the risks that the employee may be exposed to at work and not the risks they might face whilst travelling into and from the office. And the government guidance covers work-related travel, but not travel to and from the office, although it does say 2 points. The first is that employees should stagger arrival and departure times to reduce crowding into and out of the workplace. And also it says you need to provide facilities for alternative ways of travelling. However, we're obviously in slightly different times, so it is entirely possible in this unusual situation where public health risks associated with using public transport are so significant, the courts might conclude that your implied duties of care and to maintain trust and confidence, it might mean that you should take some account of the risks associated with an employee's commute. And also relevant here is that in certain cases, employees have a statutory right to not attend a workplace if they have a reasonable belief that they're in serious and imminent danger. And it's less clear if this applies to the dangers of travel, but certainly I think over the next year or so, I think we're going to see some really interesting cases arising from this point. So something you need to be aware of, you need to change your mindset and sort of factor in the whole, the bigger picture here and not limit it just to the risks that you might foresee in the workplace. And certainly leaving aside, obviously, the legal position, commuting by public transport will be a real concern to many of your employees, so will add to the pressures that they're already facing at the moment. And also the capacity of the public transport network is going to be really restricted. So there's good reasons to do what you can to ensure that employees can get into work and can do so, obviously, in the safest way possible. And this might involve adjusting hours, providing extra parking, taking steps to enable more cycling, or I think scooting might be the next big thing anyway. So what are the steps when it comes to planning? Well, first of all, you need to communicate I suggest that you communicate the official guidance, government guidance to travel on staff, and I put a link to that on the PowerPoint slide. I then prepare a workforce travel plan before your workers return. So there's now tools that use employees' postcodes, for example, to provide businesses with insights to make informed decisions on their employees' commuting problems. There's also other software that enables employees to send personal travel plans with options ranked in order of maximum social distancing to help workers make informed decisions. Another good option is a good old survey asking employees about their journey into and out of the office, what the options are for them, how they feel about that, etc. And the idea with that is that you build up a map of your staff's commutes and consider the interventions based on that insight. And you need to be determining if there are any workers that can't meet the social distancing guidelines by walking, running, cycling, or driving to work, or in other words, those employees who can't avoid the use of public transport. Third point is that you need to protect workers arriving and leaving the workplace. So for lots of businesses and lots of clients that I've spoken to, really the entrance and the exit points are a real pinch point, because they often act as bottlenecks, but also because they don't always have complete control over those areas, which you might share with other occupiers, and equally might be under the control or more control of the landlords. So you really need to consider opportunities to reduce the risk in these areas. And things that you may want to consider, as I've mentioned already, are perhaps staggering arrival and departure times, reducing queues, for example, by having more entry points into the workplace, perhaps providing more storage for workers for clothes and for bags, and considering whether you can shift that further into the building rather than currently where it might be near entrance or exit points. You need to look at managing queues, for example, through floor markings, signs, or introducing one-way flow at entry and exit points, and also considering the impact on public spaces if you're going to be spilling out onto the road or onto pavements, and how that's going to work in practice. You might want to provide hand sanitation at buildings' entry and exit points, and also not use touch-based security devices such as keypads. You should perhaps review your access points and entry points requirements. So for example, you might want to deactivate turnstiles requiring pass checks in favour perhaps of showing someone a pass, showing security perhaps at a safe distance. And then also collaborating with other tenants that might share those premises with you to perhaps minimise the people on site, or to work with your landlord to make sure you're putting in place the right measures and steps to protect the communal areas. And also the final point you might want to think about is perhaps considering additional safe facilities for runners, walkers and cyclists, and where they're going to store their equipment. You know, will they want somewhere where they can shower? Is that something you can offer? So the way people are using buildings is obviously going to be quite different, and something as the UNHR will want to have a think about if you haven't started doing that already. And the final point is to plan for staff to use face coverings on public transport. I think most businesses, they might possibly offer employees the opportunity to use face coverings in the workplace, but certainly even if you're not doing that, then you're going to, if you have employees travelling in who are using the public transport, you've really got to think about the benefits of training those staff how to use face masks effectively, and really importantly how to dispose of those face masks, so to make sure they're not coming into the office and storing those in handbags or on the desks, and or not disposing of those properly. So again, how are you going to get rid of that waste, potentially contaminated waste, once it's coming into the office, and how are you going to do that safely? That's all from me on that front, and I will now pass over to Melanie, who's going to talk about redundancies and ACAS.
Thanks, Rona. I hope you can all hear me. Can you hear me? Rona, can you give me a thumbs up? Great, thank you. I'm going to talk about efficiency planning, and rather than focus on redundancies, what I want to do is use this time for you to think about how you can best save your costs. So if we look at the next slide, most businesses' principal costs are going to be their rent and their salaries. They're often viewed as their fixed costs, although I think we've learnt in this crisis so far that they're definitely not. There is an obvious option to negotiate any sums that might be due under our rent, and whilst our contracts are in place, they will often include an ability to have flexibility at this time. The reason I say that is in relation to rent. Many businesses at the moment, the landlords are giving them flexibility because there is a legal moratorium. Employers who have rent problems can talk to their landlords, ask for deferrals, ask for some flexibility, and in the worst case scenario that they couldn't pay, the business would be able to continue to work in those premises, and the landlord would not be able to remove them. There's a moratorium in place. And similarly, when it comes to salaries, obviously you have a contractual obligation to pay the salaries that are due to your staff. However, many businesses are already having discussions with their staff using the furlough arrangements that Patrick talked about, and looking at other mechanisms they can use in order to reduce their costs. I think the key points that you need to think about when you're going into a redundancy exercise, or looking at how you plan for greater efficiency as you go into the next phase, is what you need to save, what you need to achieve. And I think that will help you define whether you are going to need to make redundancies, the number of redundancies you'll need to make, and what other strategies you could put in place. The other thing to think about is your timescale. Many of us are aware that the furlough scheme was extended in order to prevent mass redundancies. We have seen some large redundancies, BA, Rolls-Royce examples, but on the whole, many businesses have held on to their staff, they've held on to their talent, and what they've done is they've reduced perhaps working hours in consultation with staff instead. As Patrick mentioned, if you're reducing the terms and conditions of employees, their pay, their hours, or if you're making them redundant, you'll often have to go through a period of collective consultation. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but it's important to, because it's relevant to your timescale. If you need to achieve a particular saving by a particular quarter end or a particular date, the fact that you will have to undertake 30 or 90 days of consultation or 45 days of consultation is going to impact on when those savings will be achieved. And redundancy isn't really a saving in the immediate term. It has a cost attached for the notice pay and any redundancy pay. So we need to think through, when are we going to be able to make those payments, and do we need to make them at all? The other thing I would always recommend is that you check all of your contracts. Apologise for any HRs on the line who are hearing this. When I'm not trying to give you more homework, but it is very important to look at what flexibility you may already have in the contracts with your various types of staff. Next slide. We can't miss the headlines. At the moment, we're very much told that we can achieve more efficiency with fewer working days. We're also being told that the Chancellor is being encouraged to look at a 4-day working week. And I think these are the real signals to businesses not to make redundancies. And the 12 tips that I'm going to go on to discuss are in this mindset. They're talking about how we retain our staff. So if we can go on to our first lot of tips. The first one I would be thinking about is look at the casual workers and agency staff that you have working for you. I think that we have to look at those staff, particularly if they don't have any chance of saying that they are employees, and considering when we could remove them. They will often have shorter periods of notice, and they will often be in the situation where they wouldn't have a right to any redundancy payment. So they might be the easiest staff to look at not renewing. Similarly, when you're dealing with contractors, it's wise to look at whether you would continue to need them, and if so, whether you could fail to renew their contracts. The third thing we're looking and recommending is that you look at recruitment freezes and any job offers that perhaps have been accepted but the individual hasn't started. You might want to withdraw that job offer. Now, this will depend on what people do, but it may be that you have existing staff that you could retrain to cover a particular area of need. And this might also be cost neutral. If the joiner has a notice period which expires before they would have started with you, then they would not be entitled to any salary for a notice period. So that might be another cost saving. Many businesses have been offering an enhanced payment to staff if they want to consider voluntary redundancy. And redundancy here is something that would be advantageous to the business, because you would achieve that without having to go through a formal information consultation exercise. If the individual wants to volunteer and it is purely voluntary, then your obligation would of course be to pay any notice pay and any redundancy pay that you've agreed with them or in a union recognition agreement. Talking about early retirement, this is another option that businesses have been looking at. And it may be that through this period of lockdown, many people have reassessed what they want to do with their lives. We've seen people that have decided that they are not going to continue to work in the full-time job in the office. They want to explore something that they've always wanted to do. And this might be an opportunity to have that discussion with staff and see if that's something that they want to achieve. Similarly, you might want to incentivize people as you might for voluntary redundancy. Next slide, please. The other things that you might want to consider that will have an immediate impact on your bottom line: dialing back the hours of those on zero-hour contracts. We know that many businesses will continue to operate 0 hours contracts. It gives them flexibility, and that's a mechanism that you can use. I talked about looking at your contracts, and one of the things that has been very informative is looking at how many contracts contain the right to lay off. This is something that needs to be set out in the black and white of a contract, and it will allow you as a business to decide to reduce the working hours of your staff members. If it's in your contract, you are one of the lucky ones, because it is quite rare. But it does mean that you can put people onto shorter working hours without their agreement. They've already pre-agreed in the contract. The thing to bear in mind here, of course, is that if they are working reduced hours, you still need to comply with the national minimum wage. The 8th suggestion is that you remove any discretionary benefits. Now, this is something that obviously staff have come to look upon and think is something that you'll continue to provide. But most contracts contain wording which says very clearly that you have the right to remove it, to not replace it, and not to provide any financial support in its place. That's something that you could use at this time to remove discretionary benefits that have a cost to you. Many of those benefits will have an annual premium and an annual renewal. So it might be something that you need to put in the diary for when that comes up. I've already talked about staff who are seeking a change in their scene, and sabbaticals are another way to do this. They're an advantage for you as well, because the talent, the investment, all the things that you would be thinking about for the longer term wouldn't be lost. What you can do is obviously agree that the employee stays away on a reduced pay or very little pay or no pay for a period, takes a sabbatical and comes back hopefully in due course to resume the work for you. The 10th tip that we have is to try and retrain any current population that you have to cover areas where you might have a need. So, as we discussed before, if you have a consultant or you have experts that come in to do particular pieces of work, it would be sensible to look at retraining your existing population. It saves you a redundancy payment, and also it means that you have the flexibility within your existing workforce to cover business needs. And if you've done all of those things, it might be at that point that you start thinking about reducing hours and salary. We are seeing a lot in the press about reducing to a 4-day week. So those may be consultation discussions that you'll need to have with the employees, or if you're doing it on a broader scale, with their representatives, whether that's the union or whether it's the employees' representatives who've been elected. Reducing hours and salary is going to require either the employee's consent, or if they don't consent, you'll need to go through a process where you are confirming this is what the business needs, that no other alternatives would be achieving that, and then terminating them ostensibly for a fair reason called some other substantial reason. And then you'd need to offer them to be rehired on new terms with the reduced hours and the reduced salary. That could be a permanent situation, or it could be a temporary situation until you see greater recovery. The 12th tip, top tip, are about deferring salaries. We're starting to see businesses asking employees to take a reduction in the shorter term and to defer part of their salary for a period of 6 or 12 months until businesses have recovered. Now, this is another good mechanism for retaining staff, as well as ensuring that you avoid a redundancy payment. I did have a slide on redundancy, but it seems to be missing from the pack, so I'm going to talk about redundancy now. The first thing I would say is that collective consultation is going to be required where you have 20 or more dismissals proposed in a 90-day period at one establishment. This means that you have to provide specific information and you have to consult with the unions or the employees' representatives about how you're going to avoid the number of dismissals. That process needs to start at least 30 days before the first dismissal, or 45 days if you're dismissing 100 people or more. Given the exceptional nature of the pandemic, it might be that many people would be relying on the fact that you can say, we don't need to consult, we have to get on and do this. The instances that we see are probably not going to fall within that special circumstances defence. So you would face a potential financial penalty of 90 days for each employee. So we don't recommend that you omit any information consultation. I think the particular challenge you'll face is obviously making sure that the furloughed staff are available to be informed and participate in any information consultation, particularly if they're not checking work emails and work phone. It's not ideal, and it will slow down the process if line managers and the HR are having to follow up with individuals to make sure that they're in the loop. But it is worth doing to avoid that penalty. We have had new ACAS guidance which requires that you consider furloughing before you consider redundancies. This becomes more and more important when the tribunal is being told that it could be unfair if the furlough was not considered as an alternative. So we do recommend that to avoid an unfair dismissal finding. The other things to bear in mind, of course, as always, that you need to select people fairly. And that means that you cannot automatically look to those who've been put on furlough and select them for redundancy. You'd need to do a new fair selection process. And do bear in mind that employees have the right to be accompanied at redundancy meetings, and they have the right to their full salary during a period of notice. This means that even if they had been on furlough leave or are on furlough leave, their salary has to be 100% of their normal pay and cannot be reduced to purely the 80% of 2,500. I'm going to go on now to talk a little bit more about how we utilise ACAS early conciliation processes. If we can think about the situation we would normally be in, possibly making very few terminations in any given period. At the moment, you'd be making many or potentially making many terminations, and there are a number of ways that we can use ACAS in this process. The first one is if we were wanting to achieve a binding settlement with staff. If I agreed with an employee that they wanted to take voluntary redundancy, or they wanted to leave under a particular arrangement that we were talking about, sabbatical or something like that, where they weren't going to return, then I would be thinking about offering them enhancement. But in return, I'd want to make sure that they wouldn't bring a claim against me, the employer. One of the ways that you can do this is using a settlement agreement, and many of you will use those. There is an alternative process where ACAS can provide an agreement, and that agreement can be a binding settlement on the member of staff. So you have the certainty that there will be no claim. If, on my second point, there was a dispute with the employee who was selected says, you have selected me because I am a woman, because I have childcare responsibilities, and therefore you assumed I would want to be made redundant rather than my male colleague who earns the same and does the same hours. In that situation where the employee might be claiming that there's a discrimination issue, you can of course negotiate and seek to resolve that matter using ACAS. ACAS is a great tool in that you can get additional commitments from employees that they wouldn't necessarily be obliged to give by the employment tribunal. In the employment tribunal, the employer is largely going to be able to get a confirmation that they haven't unfairly dismissed or they haven't discriminated. Or if the employee succeeds in their claim, the employee would be entitled to financial compensation. But in a settlement agreement or in an agreement concluded with ACAS, you can achieve other things. It might be that you want to ensure that this is confidential, particularly if it's a sensitive hire, particularly if there are a large number involved. You might want to achieve new restrictive covenants if there aren't any covenants in the contract with the employee, and you want to protect the business going forward, protect its client relationships, and ensure that other employees aren't being solicited away. It might be that you want to prevent the employee from disparaging the business, from posting things on social media, particularly if there's been a history of the employee having a strong opinion about what is going on in the business or about how health and safety is being handled. These are all things that can be incorporated into an agreement. But most importantly, I would say that ACAS Early Conciliation is an intelligence gathering exercise. In this process, you can find out what the employee is looking for by way of settlement, but also when they are seeking that payment. And this becomes very, very important because at the moment, employment tribunals are very much burdened and stretched in their resources. This often means that any claims are not being able to be pursued for about a 12-month period. So an employee who is seeking a smaller payment over in the immediate term to tide them over might be prepared to accept something a little bit less than that in order to get that payment urgently. Equally, if an employee reveals that through ACAS that they are going to be using their insurance, then you would know that that employee is not going to be deterred from bringing the claim just because it will take a long time. But you will be able to persuade, hopefully, the insurer that that case does not have reasonable prospects of succeeding. So there's many things that you can use ACAS Early Conciliation for. It's a process where you're often contacted and asked if you want to engage. And we'd certainly recommend that you do that, even if it's not your intention to make a payment to the employee. You can use it as a means and a tool to try and negotiate and make them realise what's gone on previously. It benefits from confidentiality and it's without prejudice as well, which means that the staff member could then not go on to put that information in the employment tribunal. They couldn't put it in any open correspondence, any grievance or anything like that. So it's a very good way of protecting yourself. Don't say anything that you wouldn't want to be repeated because individuals sometimes don't get the difference. I think we're very close to our time, so I'm going to wrap up there. But if we had time for a few questions, I think our coordinator would be very happy to assist us. Sam, have we got any questions from the audience?
No, I can have a look down at the Q&A. I don't think we do have any questions, unless if you've got any now, then by all means do send them through. But no, I don't think so. As I mentioned at the beginning, obviously our contact details are on the screen. So if anyone thinks of anything that they would like to have asked after the webinar today, then by all means do feel free to email Mel, Patrick or myself, and we will happily get back to you and talk that through. But yeah, given that there's no questions, I will then say goodbye from all of us. I hope you found today useful, and yeah, do give us some feedback. If there's any topics that you would like us to cover going forward, then please, yeah, send us an email and we will try and cover those if we can in the future. Okay, well, good luck and be in touch very soon. Many thanks.
Thank you.